You're watching France 24. I'm Mark Owen. These are the headlines. It's a week that could see major moves on Brexit. British lawmakers are seeking to take control of Parliament so they can launch a bill to prevent a no-deal Brexit. Boris Johnson, speaking earlier outside Number 10, was heckled by crowds who were crying out, "Stop the coup." Situation in Hong Kong, the protests there have continued throughout this Monday. The violence of the weekend echoed in many ways. Skirmishes breaking out after nightfall between police and demonstrators. Unprecedented damage in the Bahamas. Hurricane Dorian's winds of near 250 kilometers per hour have brought rain, and with that, extensive flooding. People on the east coast of the US are being urged to evacuate ahead of the arrival of the storm. Thank you very much for being with us. It's a week that could see major moves on Brexit. British lawmakers seeking to take control of Parliament so they can launch a bill to prevent a no-deal Brexit. This has been seen as a direct attempt to undermine Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as well as his cohort of hard Brexit-supporting cabinet ministers. The plan is to try to push back the Brexit date to January the 31st next year, extending, if you like, Article 50. Labour MP Hilary Benn says the purpose of this is to ensure the UK doesn't leave the EU without a proper deal in place. Well, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, speaking outside Number 10 and being heckled by a big crowd at the end of the street crying "Stop the coup," spoke to say that he now thinks a deal could be done by October the 31st, the current Brexit date.
I want everybody to know there are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay. We're leaving on the 31st of October, no ifs or buts. We will not accept any attempt to go back on our promises or scrub that referendum. And armed and fortified with that conviction, I believe we will get a deal at that crucial summit in October, a deal that Parliament will certainly be able to scrutinise.
Well, a vote tomorrow lost by Johnson could see an election being triggered in the UK. Dave Keating is our correspondent in Brussels. He's got more from there.
From a Brussels perspective, Johnson was right when he said that the Parliament voting to block no deal would take the legs out from under him in terms of his negotiation, because he has placed that threat of walking away with no deal as the centerpiece of his negotiating strategy. And so, of course, the whole purpose of suspending Parliament was to take that out of the equation, to make the EU see, no, I can really do this. The Parliament can't block me. Now, MPs opposed to no-deal Brexit have kind of gotten their act together quicker than he might have thought, and so they can head off that attempt to suspend Parliament in order to avoid this, and that's why he's using the threat of a general election. But in terms of whether Brussels is worried about this, I think it's really important to point out that everyone I have talked to here in Brussels, even when it looked like Johnson may have been successful in taking that block of a no-deal Brexit off the table. In other words, that he could actually follow through with this threat. There really wasn't movement here. Michel Barnier, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, opined in the British media. He said nothing has changed. The EU still insists on the backstop unless Johnson can come forward with a credible alternative, which seems effectively impossible in the next couple of weeks. So even if Johnson gets his way here and is able to intimidate MPs away from casting this vote with his threat of a general election, from a Brussels perspective, it doesn't actually seem like anything changes, because the EU seems very ready to go to a no-deal scenario on October 31st, whatever happens tomorrow. If the UK asks for an extension, they will get it, because the EU doesn't want to be seen as the one who forces a no-deal Brexit. Even French President Emmanuel Macron, who is really seen as the most hard line on this issue, knows that is not good optics. But really, from the EU side, there are a lot of people here in Brussels who just really want a no-deal Brexit at this point, who are kind of tired of all of this, are very aware that the new commission starts office on the 1st of November, and they want to get on with their business here. So I don't think there's any risk that the EU would object to that request for an extension, whoever requests it, whether it's Johnson or maybe he has maybe after a general election, Jeremy Corbyn becomes prime minister and comes here to Brussels on the 18th of October and asks for that extension. But the common wisdom here in Brussels is that whoever asks for it and however long it's for, they will grant it because the EU does not want to be seen as the one throwing the UK into a chaotic no-deal scenario.
Dave Keating, our correspondent there in Brussels. We are watching all developments on the issues in London and from the Brussels perspective as Brexit continues to be a major story for us here at France 24. Next, violence on the streets of Hong Kong this weekend continued this Monday. Peaceful protests broken up by police using tear gas. This is thousands of young people boycotted their studies to demonstrate against Beijing's alleged interference there.
The start of a 2-week citywide strike. On Monday, thousands of university students in Hong Kong marked the end of their summer break by skipping classes and protesting.
I skipped one classes to express my voice and opinion to Hong Kong. It's more important than I study in classrooms. So I am right here.
This school strike escalating the pro-democracy movement that has already rocked the city for more than 3 months. And students weren't the only ones protesting Monday. Thousands of striking workers congregated at Hong Kong's iconic Tamar Park to rally in front of government offices. And there were clashes with police as well. Demonstrators disrupted the morning subway commute, blocking train doors to prevent them from closing. Officers responded with batons and made several arrests. Clashes between Hong Kong police and protesters have become increasingly violent, with authorities criticized for the use of force. But the central Chinese government stands behind the tactics.
The Chinese central government supports the law-based administration of Hong Kong's government under the leadership of Chief Executive Carrie Lam. And we also support the Hong Kong police's efforts to stop violence and restore order in accordance with law.
This weekend, China issued a stern warning to protesters, saying the end is coming. The movement is doing its best to prove the mainland wrong.
The first group of over 600 migrants has been moved from an overcrowded and poorly equipped camp on the Greek island of Lesbos. The migrants were taken aboard a ship bound for the port of Thessaloniki on mainland Greece.
Hurrying out of a camp that some described as hell. A first group of more than 600 migrants, mostly from Afghanistan, were evacuated from Lesbos Monday morning. Another 700 were set to follow. For many, leaving the Moria camp is a major relief. Heat and overcrowding have made conditions there oppressive.
Go to the other side, and inside the camp you see the people sleeping in the street, and it's very hard. Families, not singles.
It was the most vulnerable migrants, children, the ill, and the elderly, who were selected for relocation to the Greek mainland. The move follows a spike in migrant arrivals from Turkey this summer.
Thursday we had a big arrival in the afternoon, between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. 13 boats arrived in a matter of half an hour. It is one of the most, I would say, the biggest arrivals we've had since 2015 and 16.
Crossings into Greece dropped after Turkey signed a deal with the EU in March 2016, imposing tighter checks along the coast. But in recent months, nearly 100 people a day have made it across. Altogether, the UN's refugee agency says the island of Lesbos was sheltering nearly 11,000 migrants at the end of August, 4 times its capacity.
The campaign for the presidential election in Tunisia is now officially underway. The winning candidate will succeed Beij Caïd Essebsi, the veteran politician dying of natural causes in July this year. In many ways, the legacy of the Arab Spring is at stake. Tunisia, of course, a place where the revolution that shook the region began in 2010.
Less than 2 weeks to win over some 7 million voters. Monday officially opens what promises to be a hectic campaign period ahead of Tunisia's presidential elections. In 2014, the choice was clearer. On one side, Beji Caïd Essebsi and his newly formed Nida Tunis party. On the other, incumbent Monsef Marzouki, who took office in 2011. This year, the political landscape is much more fragmented. Several Nida Tunis candidates are in the running, as well as Prime Minister Youssef Chahed, who left the party earlier this year to launch his own. The moderate Islamist party Ennahda is putting forward a presidential candidate for the first time. Media mogul Nabil Karoui, for his part, is campaigning from jail after being arrested on charges of money laundering. The candidates are all up against steep economic and social challenges, starting with unemployment, which exceeds 15%. Their fate rests largely in the hands of Tunisia's youth. More than 2/3 of voters are under the age of 25. Several of the candidates are pushing for changes to the constitution, which would expand presidential powers. Currently, the president's authority is restricted mostly to national security and foreign affairs. Starting on September 11th, the candidates will go head-to-head in a first-ever series of live televised debates. One more new variable in an election seen as vital to defending the democratic gains of the Arab Spring.
Ebola and conflict. The UN Secretary-General is calling for an effort stepped up to resolve the major dual problems affecting the Democratic Republic of Congo. 2,000 people have been killed in the DRC over the past year by the spread of the deadly virus. Antonio Guterres is also calling for greater cooperation between UN peacekeepers and local military to try to ease the conflict in the east of the country.
Antonio Guterres did not make any specific announcements, but he did stay 3 days in Congo. The message was that the UN is concerned about the country's difficulties. On Monday, he met President Félix Tshisekedi. Guterres wants the UN Security Council to renew the mandate of the UN mission here, MONUSCO, before the 1st of January. Peacekeepers help the national army in its struggle against armed groups like the ADF in eastern Congo.
One of the results of this visit is the decision that we took in cooperation with the President of the Republic to reinforce the operational capacity of MONUSCO, specifically in relation to the ADF. We have strengthened this cooperation between MONUSCO and the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Congo in order to be more effective.
His other priority was the fight against Ebola. Guterres traveled to Mongina near the town of Beni. This is where the epidemic broke out over a year ago. Some residents are wary of the treatment, and the UN chief congratulated those who had consulted doctors in special centers.
He showed up here. It was detected. He underwent treatment. He is cured. So I appeal to all those who are undergoing treatment and to all those who were cured. You have to be our spokespersons.
In just over a year, Ebola has killed more than 2,000 people in Congo. Guterres said donor pledges for 2019 were satisfactory, but the problem is that only 15% of them have been paid out so far.
People in the predicted path of Hurricane Dorian on the east coast of the United States are being advised to leave town. The storm's already brought extensive flooding to the Bahamas. Rescuers are being hampered by winds of 250 kilometers per hour and the heavy rains that they bring.
Palm trees, utility poles, and entire buildings submerged in water several meters deep. In this house, a wall of wind and rain lashing at the windows from every direction. This apartment building saw its entire roof ripped off, leaving shreds of insulation material hanging over a scene of utter devastation.
Look at this. We need help. Everything down. Everything down.
Residents of parts of the Bahamas archipelago have just endured some of the worst weather conditions ever recorded on our planet. Overnight, Hurricane Dorian crawled to a near standstill, pounding the Abaco Islands in Grand Bahama for hours and hours. At the storm's worst, homes and businesses were devastated by winds gusting to nearly 350 kilometers per hour, faster than a Japanese bullet train. Early reports from the eastern Bahamas indicate widespread damage, with the Prime Minister tweeting that the devastation there was unprecedented. And despite the storm not being over yet, NGOs that were preparing for Dorian for days before it hit have already admitted they have been completely overwhelmed.
Our Red Cross National Society on ground have been preparing, but obviously this is the heaviest hurricane to pass over Bahamas, and therefore we expect the humanitarian needs to be far beyond what preparations have been made for beforehand.
As Hurricane Dorian continues to move across the Bahamas at a snail's pace, the islands will see severe hurricane conditions until the early hours of Tuesday morning.